Damen und Herren, ich bitte Platz zu nehmen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats.
Ich darf Sie sehr herzlich.
I would like to welcome you to the meeting that we are holding together with the Subcommittee on Human Rights and the delegation to the EU-Russia Parliamentary Cooperation Committee. I'd like to welcome the chair of that body, Ottmar Karas, who is here. I would like to request that at the back
Starts to become quiet.
I think that's scared.
Ich freue mich, dass wir Mikhail.
I'm delighted to welcome Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the founder of the Open Russia movement. Mr. Khodorkovsky has already had an opportunity to meet us in Strasbourg, but it was in an unofficial setting. So, I think for us, it's a very important opportunity to say to him that the abuse of justice, which obviously took place in relation to you, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that such verdicts can be reached with long periods of confinement, and it certainly doesn't correspond to our concept of the rule of law. Amnesty International felt the same way, and they designated you a prisoner of conscience, and between 2003 and 2013, you were in a labour camp, you were in prison. And we're glad that since your release, you have found the courage and the strength to engage in efforts on behalf of Russian civil society to bolster it, and with the relaunching of the Open Russia movement. We are aware that presently relations to Russia, because of the way it has proceeded in neighbouring countries, that our relations are in a critical state. Now, I don't want to talk about Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, but there are other countries that could also be listed. We'll be very interested to hear what you have to say about these cases, and we'd be particularly interested in hearing about your views on the internal development of Russia and the way in which democratic opposition has an opportunity to develop, where opportunities for cooperation exist, and whether there is a chance of an independent civil society surviving. So, Mr. Khodorkovsky, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you very much, dear friends, for agreeing to listen to me. I would like to give you some of my impressions about what's happening now on the international arena connected with my country. Today, the system of European-wide security is facing its most serious challenge since the end of the Second World War. In essence, Russia's open annexation of Crimea and its barely concealed annexation of a part of the territory of the southeast of Ukraine are marking the end of the Yalta-Potsdam world order. 70 years have passed since Yalta, and one cannot say that that was entirely a time of calm and stability for Europe. But not once in all this time did a founder country of the Yalta-Potsdam system openly violate the main principle that has been at the foundation of the Europe-wide post-war consensus. War cannot be a way of resolving territorial disputes in Europe. It's not about fairness or unfairness of a concrete situation, a specific case, but it's about principle. The Russian regime has once again opened up a Pandora's box and unleashed a threat that has already laid waste to the European continent in the past many times. Moreover, when it comes to the question of territorial claims, Russia is actually more vulnerable than other countries, not less. It is symbolic that what began with Crimea is ending with Crimea as well. The Kremlin leadership's goal is far from just being geopolitical. It merely wants to return to a foreign policy comfort zone in which no external factors can be a threat to the regime's existence. The extent of the Kremlin regime's hopes is a return to the Helsinki Accords, but without the third basket. This is an attempt to carry out an overhaul of European history, not from the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but to go 15 years further back, an attempt to make corrections to the policy of détente. The Kremlin wants one simple thing, to return to the policy of peaceful coexistence with total non-interference in its internal affairs. In other words, it expects recognition of the Kremlin's right to do anything it wants in its own zone of influence. And of course, nothing should be said about human rights. As old-fashioned as this doctrine may seem, it represents a serious danger for Europe. Russia remains, as it always was, a country with colossal military potential, sufficient to destroy the whole of humanity many times over. In case anyone's forgotten about this, the Kremlin is prepared to remind you. This whole strategic military potential, which is doubtless going to continue to exist for a long time yet, has proven to be under the control of people with an extremely low level of political and moral accountability. So there is no quick and easy way out of this situation. Despite the fact that the aggression against Ukraine was clearly wrong, Europe is going to have to look for a compromise in relations with the Kremlin regime. Because the alternative to compromise is global war. This is an objective reality that cannot just be brushed aside. But as a famous 20th century Russian political figure once said, there are compromises and compromises. A policy of appeasing the Kremlin is a path which will lead to a major war far more quickly than many conformist European politicians and businessmen might realize. We need to remember that the crisis in Ukraine is not so much just a local conflict. It is a challenge to the whole old policy in relation to the authoritarian regime in Russia. A consequence of the crisis has been the emergence of new hotspots on the map of Europe. For now, limited by the boundaries of 2 oblasts, 2 regions in the southeast of Ukraine. But this conflict is only local because of the current political conditions prevailing in Europe, and because of the balance of power which exists at the moment between Russia and the West. But these conditions and this balance of power are far more likely to be variables than constants. In the Kremlin and around the Kremlin today, there are more and more people who are candidly counting on a rapid demise of Europe as a consequence of a full-scale political and economic crisis. In the Kremlin, they are seriously hoping that, for example, Britain will withdraw from the European Union, or the default of one of the Schengen Treaty countries might occur, and that will lead to the collapse of the Eurozone and to the appearance in Europe of clashes in politics, fault lines along the north-south or east-west line. And in this case, every effort will be made to ensure that the dividing line in Europe will pass not along the course of the northern Donetsk, but once again along the Vistula and the Oder. The hawks in the Kremlin are not just waiting for a crisis to happen in Europe. They are prepared actively to trigger its emergence, notwithstanding the fact that the new world global economic crisis would be deadly, first and foremost, for the Russian economy. Nevertheless, under pressure from these people, it's very likely that the Kremlin will be trying to provoke Europe as best it can, because the old Trotskyite ideas about permanent revolution have now strangely become popular once again, only now with an ultra-right nationalistic tinge. They dream of creating a new ultra-right international, which would unite all the reactionary anti-liberal forces of Europe. Basically, Putin has already begun to wage a major psychological war against Europe, increasing the propaganda and the presence here of this agent of corruption. And this expansion will mean that Europe has to respond with a serious mobilization as well. It's a new Cold War, and it is not something that will go away in a year. The struggle that has now unfolded in Ukraine is taking place not for territory, not for or against the restoration of Russia's influence. This is not a war about Russia's interests at all. It is about the interests of a group of people who have seized power in Russia. This is a struggle for and against the principles of a state based on the rule of law, for and against freedoms, human rights, for and against European values. Is there any hope of being able to cope with this threat effectively? Well, there is, and it stems from the very nature of Russian bureaucracy, which by and large is rational and apolitical. There are many people in the Russian establishment who are sober-minded, who think rationally, and on the whole are oriented towards European values. But today, these people are being forced to submit to a political will that has been formulated by a criminally corrupt minority whose only goal is to hold on to power. The majority in the Russian elite understand perfectly well that the Kremlin's course today is leading the country to a catastrophe. And this majority is the restraining premise that must not allow Russia and the whole world along with it to slide into the abyss. But today, when there's virtually a neo-totalitarian regime established in Russia, a regime in which there's no place for anyone who thinks differently, confusion reigns in the midst of the Russian opposition, because there are no mechanisms for it to come to power legitimately at this stage. However, the goal of the existence of the opposition in Russia now consists not in coming to power, because for the moment that is an unattainable goal. The aim is to serve as a restraining factor for reactionary forces which are prodding the Kremlin towards global confrontation. How balanced the policy of the Kremlin will be in domestic and foreign terms depends on a large part on how organized the opposition is and how principled a position it will take. Today the opposition in Russia is fighting not just for Russia but for the whole of Europe, and it is precisely for this reason that its efforts deserve serious support. So what then can Russian patriots who don't agree with the Putin doctrine realistically expect from Europe? It would be desirable if Europe's policies were to be intelligent, honest and differentiated. Now, when I say first that Europe's policy should be intelligent, I mean it has to be based on realism and an understanding of the fact that Russia and Putin are not the same thing. Sooner or later, Putin will be gone, but Russia will remain. And it's going to have to find a place in a greater Europe. Perhaps it is for the very reason that this place was not determined quite in the way it should have been after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the phenomenon of Putin occurred, and we ended up where we are today. In other words, we have to divide the question into two parts. Russia and Europe is one thing. Putin in Europe is something completely different. When I say that European policy has to be honest, what I'm urging you to do is not to resort to simplifications, not painting life in Russia in black and white colors, in a kind of caricature. I'm also urging you not to apply double standards with regard to what happens in Russia. And this can happen as a two-way street, indeed, when you forgive Russia things that you never forgive anybody else, and when Russia is denounced for things that are accepted as normal in other countries. And when I say the policy should be a differentiated approach, I mean first and foremost that sanctions, for example, need to be both intelligent and honest. Dear friends, the friends that I have who are opposed to Putin say to me that I shouldn't speak against sanctions because a lot of them feel that this is what is holding back or spurring on the aggressive attitude of the Kremlin. I agree, but nevertheless, I think it would be a major political mistake to have sanctions against Russia as a country. I think the application of sanctions against the Russian economy as a whole would be a mistake. The logic that if life gets worse for the Russian people, they will understand more quickly just what bad rulers they've elected seems to me to be completely unacceptable. Whatever short-term and highly doubtful effect may be achieved in the short run may be offset by many strategic minuses in the future. The Russian people must not be pushed away from Europe. But at the same time, we have to be much tougher in terms of targeted sanctions against corrupt officials, law enforcers, and their business partners. And very little is being done now in this area. Accordingly, three very important practical questions arise. Firstly, despite all the sanctions, there should be no deleterious effect on cultural and scientific exchanges. There should be assistance in education and to the new generation. Whatever the noble motives may be when you introduce restrictions and prohibitions in the field of culture and education and science, cultural ties between Russia and Europe must be protected. And Kobzon, the singer, has the right to participate in them too, by the way. Let him re-educate himself by looking at Europe. On the contrary, we need to promote the growth of academic and cultural exchanges. This is a guarantee for the future victory of the European choice in Russia. Secondly, the Russian opposition must be protected from persecution in Europe through Russian political manhunts. Look at what's happening. At the same time as the world is discussing sanctions, Putin is welcoming in the Kremlin the head of Interpol and basically thanking him for assisting in stamping out the opposition. Corrupt officials barely concealing that they are agents of the secret police use stolen money to hire the best European lobbyists to attack human rights advocates. European courts agree to hear falsified decisions in a matter-of-fact way, decisions of Russian courts that are merely the expression of a repressive system, and this is happening even when other courts in other European countries have already spoken, for example, on a question of extradition. Thirdly, we need to build a wall against the corrupt activity of the Kremlin regime in Europe. It is unacceptable when the rulers of a de facto totalitarian state in practice are openly financing their supporters here in Europe with money stolen from our people. This not only undermines your unity, it also creates completely the wrong impression of Europe in the eyes of the Russian liberal opposition. If everything can be bought, then where are the ideals for which we have been wasting our lives? And finally, I know that today's regime won't be there forever. It probably has no more than 10 years left, and maybe even far less. And it depends on our joint efforts how much damage it can cause during this time and what will come after it. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Karas, chair of the Russia delegation. And then you.
Herr Khodorkovsky.
Mr. Khodorkovsky, dear Elmar Brok, first of all, I would like to thank the Foreign Affairs Committee and its chairman for enabling this debate to be held together with the delegation to Russia and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. Secondly, Mr. Khodorkovsky, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you. We all owe you a debt of gratitude for the clarity of the words that you have spoken and for the example that you set. My question to you is as follows. In Russia, we get the impression, and as is being set out to us, the impression is that Mr. Putin's behavior is something which is getting more and more adherents. And public criticism within the Soviet Union and of Putin is becoming less. I mean, how do you see the public debate in Russia about the way that Putin's government is behaving, and what about developments in the within Russia in society? What can we do to contribute to efforts to establish or democratic efforts? Because we have the impression that the opposition has weakened over the last few months, and that public criticism has diminished. And you also talked about exchanges in science and culture. I share those views. Yesterday, the chair of the Committee on Education in the Duma said that in Russia there is ever less interest being shown in this exchange, because in a body such as the EU, which imposes sanctions, there seems to be little interest in such an exchange. I think that we should step up these links or these efforts, but of course, the counter-argument is always the sanctions. Obviously, the question of the interplay between Russian and European forces, I didn't quite understand your criticism of the sanctions, because they are being looked at in a more personified and differentiated way. Could you please explain how further differentiation might occur, or how you might envisage such further differentiation? And another question, what is the current state of play in relation to human rights organizations and the issue of memorial in relation to the case which has been brought? And what about Russia's voting rights in the Council of Europe? Because you know that we'll have the expiry of the ban at the end of the year.
Gracias, Presidente. Bienvenido, señor Khodorkovsky.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Khodorkovsky. You'll know that this Parliament worked for your release. We tabled 6 resolutions, 2 reports. asking for you to be freed, so we're very glad to see you here with us today. My questions are quite like the previous speakers, but rather more specific. What is the situation of human rights defenders in Russia at this moment? Do you have any relationship with them? Can you help them from your movement? And what do you think Russian society thinks of our sanctions, the Western world sanctions? Do you think that they can influence Russian public opinion towards a bad opinion of the European Union? Do you think we ought to be behaving in a different way towards public opinion, apart from the sanctions which affect a few members of the regime? What ought we to be doing to reach Russian public opinion? And what should we be doing about the human rights defenders?
Thank you, Chairman. Dear Mr. Khodorkovsky, it's indeed a great pleasure having you here in this hall. And you, to many of us, are one of the symbols of the human rights violations in Russia. So again, I mean, I would refer to the first questions that were already placed, and the situation of human rights right now in Russia is, in many cases, appalling right now. I would mention just a few cases. One of them is the Tatars of Crimea, the recently occupied territory of Ukraine. Then we had a case of soldier mothers in Russia. You probably know the case. So my question is, how do you see the situation right now with human rights in Russia? And how do you see the perspective? Meaning that, is the battle lost already? Or is it relocating, taking different shape or form? Thank you.
Das war vorbildlich.
Thank you. That was exemplary. We should only speak for a maximum of 1.5 minutes each because there are 18 requests for the floor. And I'm going to be closing the speakers list now. Joe Leinen. Microphone, please. Unfortunately, the speaker's microphone is not working.
Geht das jetzt?
Yes, this microphone is working. So, third time round, thank you very much for your clear words. I come from Germany, and I'm sure you know that Germany is a propaganda target of Mr. Putin because there have been a lot of attempts to destabilize public opinion. You have said that in spite of all the criticisms of Europe, we have to reach an agreement with Russia, but what would the substance of such an agreement be? I entered into politics with Willy Brandt because we had this policy of understanding with many countries, including Russia. But what are we supposed to agree with Mr. Putin about? And then I have a question in my capacity as chair of the China delegation. Mr. Karas chairs the Russia delegation. How do you envisage this reorientation of Russia away from Europe towards other partners, particularly China? Is there any substance to this, or is this more of a propaganda show? And the Eurasian Union and the European Union, does that have any substance? Is that a framework within which we might be able to see some movement? That was... Now I'll give the floor to Demis.
Demismaker.
Mr. Demismaker.
Yeah.
Yes. Welcome on behalf of my political group as well, Mr. Khodorkovsky. A number of questions have already been put, questions which I could equally have asked. In your statement, you conveyed very clearly that Putin's Russia, because we like to call it Putin's Russia, is moving from an authoritarian to a totalitarian state. It's extremely difficult for the opposition to function because public opinion is being brainwashed. Politics are being pursued via the major newspapers and TV channels. How do you want to get in touch with ordinary Russians given that you can't operate via conventional media channels? Would the internet be a solution? The internet can play an important role in Russia. So how do you want to reach public opinion more effectively? Because I think it's necessary to do so, and perhaps that will help to bring about the changes that are required. You talked about sanctions, and you said that they shouldn't affect citizens, but what we're seeing is that the current sanctions are not without effect. And this also has been seen in the oil prices, which are going down. But what about ordinary Russian citizens? Do you think that Europe can maintain these sanctions over the longer term? Because think about European companies and SMEs, because they encounter difficulties.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Khodorkovsky, you are the only man in this hall who went through Putin's gulags. Here I am, in the center. And indeed, Putin owns to you 10 years. And he will have to compensate, find the way to how to compensate you. Putin's Russia deleted itself from the list of countries we can trust. It deleted itself from the list of countries which we can call a country with a rule of law or respecting international law. Understandably, we expect from democratic-minded Russian opposition to oppose Putin's policy. In one Twitter's question, which came to you in October, the question came to you as, are you going to return Crimea back when you become the President of Russian Federation? Your direct and very short reply was, I am giving a direct answer, no, meaning no return. And the second question was, the problem of Crimea is for decades. Would you be so kind to explain your position on Crimea? Because this House will never, I hope, recognize annexation and occupation of Crimea by Russian forces.
One success of the Kremlin's propaganda in the West, in my opinion, has been that more and more colleagues in this House and in Germany and in the UK are saying that the whole strategy of Russia is understandable and the cause is meant to be errors committed in the West, in NATO, and with the association agreement. What is your assessment of this? My second question is, you were saying that in Donbass there's a restricted regional conflict and it might develop further, but do you share fears that there would be a further invasion in the east of Ukraine by Russia?
Doctrine. Mr. Khodorkovsky, it's a real relief and joy to finally meet you here after so many years. But still many are surprised to see Mr. Putin returning to the Soviet-style behavior with KGB having taken real power in the Russian Federation. My question is, would it have been different if the Soviet totalitarian regime, its crimes against humanity, had been judged, at least morally and politically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because we still see horrible crimes, but nobody to take blame, and there's continuity of crime and aggression in real time today. How do you think, was it sort of a mistake to adopt and integrate the Soviet nomenclatura after the collapse of the Soviet Union without any discernment? Thank you.
Уважаемый господин Khodorkovsky.
Mr. Khodorkovsky, I'd like to ask you a question in your language. Here I am. On the right. Here I am. So that nothing gets lost in translation. I'm from Latvia. Of course, I will pass on your opinions about Kobzon to our minister. But I wanted to ask you two questions. First of all, what do you think about the further reaction of Russia with regard to the Baltic countries? What's that going to be? Because lately, of course, we have experienced clear demonstration of pressure and force against our republics. And secondly, how do you see your role in the future of politics in Russia?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Khodorkovsky, I want to confess I do share most of your assessment. And I want to thank you very much for coming here. Two questions. First, on Crimea, which is unanswered yet. Now Russia is deploying huge quantity of offensive and defensive materials, missiles, short and mid-range, fighter jets, among the modernest of the Russian air forces, plus Iskander 300, having some mid-range capabilities of carrying nukes. What is your assessment? Why Russia is deploying such a quantity of military equipment which completely disbalance the situation in the Black Sea? And number two, what is the purpose behind Russia is financing political parties in many EU member states? Can we consider that Russia is doing now what the former Nazi regime done before with the fifth column? Or how we can interpret this systematic and systemic action taken by Russia? Thank you.
Mr. Gurek.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. You're probably the first Russian that is our guest during this time of office. I'm happy it is you, actually, and taking the opportunity, I would like to ask, in the context of the recent initiative by Russia in the UN, I mean the resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. What is the approach of today's Russian authorities towards communism and the Soviet past? And in the context of the legalization of the memorial that we have defended, what is the attitude towards the persecutions and the infringement of human rights, the persecution of national freedoms and religious freedoms during the Soviet times? I don't mean the general statements, but I'd like you to make a short sociological synthesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Many questions have been asked, but about the economy. You know something about the economy, I think. Can Russia bear the low oil price, so the low gas price, the sanctions, maybe renewed sanctions, the fleeing away of capital? I mean, what will this be of impact to the Putin policy? Because I think that, unfortunately, we have to go all the way in the West. We can't accept annexation of Crimea, nor the troubles made in eastern Ukraine. What is your idea about, can he get through with these economic problems?
Dankeschön. Ich freue mich, Sie hier zu sehen.
Thank you. I'm glad to see you here, Mr. Khodorkovsky. Last time I saw you, you were in a cage in court, and you look better now. 2 questions. What do you mean when you talk about a compromise? And secondly, directly linked to that first question, what have we got that Russia is after, apart from recognition of its imperial ambitions? Short of that, what substance could there be for an agreement?
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Khodorkovsky, where do you get this 85% of alleged popularity that Mr. Putin enjoys in public opinion? Is public opinion not aware of the deterioration of the economy and the fall of the ruble, and doesn't that affect Mr. Putin's popularity? And secondly, Mr. Leinen mentioned this approach of Russia to China. I'm one of those who thinks that Russia's long-term interest is to come closer to the West and the United States than to China. But what do you think Russia is up to here? Do you think this approximation is sustainable in the medium and long term, and is it in Russia's interest?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Khodorkovsky, I'm one of the Lithuanian representatives. I remember very well your visit to Lithuania when Mažeikiai petroleum oil refinery was being purchased and what the consequences were. You mentioned what we should do here in Europe. However, I'd like to ask you, as a person who knows probably international politics very well, how could it happen that from 2008, when we saw that Russia was changing its military strategies, was separating, annexing territories like territories in Georgia, in Transnistria, now the Ukraine, and we still think that we are capable of some cooperation with Europe. You mentioned this as well. The main argument is nuclear devices, nuclear arms. We know what are the Russian capabilities in propaganda. If we reduce the sanctions, we will help Russia to have a bigger budget for propaganda, which led to the Second World War a long time ago. And we know that the Russian people will be even angrier with regard to the capitalists if they live in bigger poverty. The question is this: are we right to leave Ukraine to fight on its own? Is there enough unity among the Baltic states addressing a major issue, a major challenge to all of us? And is there enough unity in Europe concerning the Eastern European and Southern European countries with respect to the problem which actually exists?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Khodorkovsky, it's good to see you in freedom. Your son and others have fought hard to keep your case on our radar. I'm over here. I'm also glad to hear that you make this clear distinction between the people of Russia and the Kremlin. We do the same, and we think that that's really important. That is why, for the sake of pursuing the rule of law and justice, we worked in this Parliament to adopt the Magnitsky List, which in the US had a different reception than in Europe. Could you share your thoughts on the impact of such targeted sanctions on abusers of human rights, and also on the divisions of Europe in that case? How would the impact be on the Russian side, do you think, if the EU would speak more strongly with one voice? Second question is your thoughts on the role of civil society in Russia. We were very worried about the closing of Memorial, the expelling of a number of international organizations. What is the impact of restricting the role of civil society and the media in Russia as a counterbalance to propaganda and political power?
Děkuji vám za slovo, pane předsedající. Uvažujeme Mikhail Borisovič, já představuji Čechy zde v Evropském parlamentě.
Mikhail Borisovich, I represent the Czech Republic here. I'm very glad that you have managed to take the time to visit us. You mentioned Ukraine today. I would like to assure you that we have followed these events closely in the defeats in Maidan. We followed that for months. We followed the fighting of the battalions in the Donbass area and people trying to defend the airport of Donetsk. And my question is, well, always in Russia, the intellectual elites have been behind the idea of progress, and you yourself mentioned the intellectual elites. But my question is this. Is there some possibility that this caviar from Ukraine should jump to Russia? And what can we do to make that happen? I think the Maidan was successful. Do you think that that can ever happen in Russia, and it wouldn't just be the intellectual elites, but that it would seize the whole country?
Voorzitter, dank u wel. Meneer Khodorkovsky, het is voor mij een eer dat...
Mr. Khodorkovsky, it's an honor that you are here, and I can say that I am in the Russia delegation, and you can count on a positive attitude from the Netherlands. And a lot of questions have been put, and now we're looking at how Putin is hit and how the citizens are affected. But my tangible question to you now is, what do we have to do that we don't, that we can do something about this citizens? Because we need to reach the area, the level that needs to be reached. I mean, if we're saying we're not doing anything about the entrepreneurs, I mean, what should we in Europe be doing right now?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to say how admired you are in the Europe, Mr. Khodorkovsky, and we are looking upon you as the hope of the future of the Russia. And I have two questions to you. The first is, when you will become the president of Russia, I'm here, look, then you will become president of Russia. Will you begin the process of deputinization of Russia? Because Germany, the experience of denazification, turned Germany in one of the most democratic, prosperous nations of the world, to which the European Union relies a lot. This is a mistake which was committed after 1991, when actually Russia was not de-Bolshevized. And my next question is about your appeal for Europe to support the opposition. It is very difficult to support the opposition which is not able to consolidate itself. What do you think about the possibility of consolidate opposition in Russia, as little as it still there is? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Mr. Khodorkovsky. Russia is already the site of a low-level Islamic insurgency in the Northern Caucasus. Do you see this spreading to the urban areas of Russia where there are maybe 3 million Muslims? And will that then become a further reason for establishing the security state that Russia already is?
Microphone, please.
We have closed the speakers list. I said that before. Yeah, that it's always the same time. Everyone was later, was already there. No, I'm seeing that. Please make it clearly next time. But this time, Mr. Khodorkovsky has the floor. He had already to go. We have 4 o'clock. Cheers, Marcel.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for all these questions. We could sit here well into the evening, I understand, on the basis of all the questions, but I won't test your patience so long. First of all, I'd like to thank most sincerely all of those who, over all these years, have supported me and my colleagues who fell into the repressive mechanism of the Russian judicial system. I am most grateful to you sincerely, and I assure you that your support meant and still means a great deal for people who are behind bars in Russia, and I think there'll be quite a few of them still for a while. So, there was a question about human rights defenders, and that's a well-placed question. Putin is quite traditional in trying to stamp out the opposition, human rights defenders, and with Western Europe, and he tries to divide them and fight against them. Any of those that try and cooperate with him, he tolerates and he cultivates, but those who are diametrically opposed to him, he will persecute. And where this is successful, he has won. Where people have stood up for themselves and showed unity, despite the fact that they might have had things to gain through individual cooperation, there Putin has had to give ground. And this relates to the question of the unity of Europe. It is to do with the opposition's behavior, and that applies to the conduct of human rights defenders. It won't be easier for him, and it won't be easy for us or for you in your profession. And you just have to live with that. What can we do to help the human rights movement? Well, we're doing everything we can, but the opportunities open to us are restricted, as you can imagine. Sanctions. The sanctions which have been announced were announced as sanctions against Russia. I know that, in fact, in the resolution, something else is written, but the propaganda machine of the Kremlin won the day on that. And there was no opposition, no counterparty EU propaganda machine to gainsay them. The sanctions are against Russia, and it's a great shame that they have led to a consolidation of public opinion around the regime. Could we do anything about that now? Well, we can and we must. If you don't just stick to words and go to deeds, and you understand that there is a difference between Putin and Russia, the Russian people, then it is quite feasible to find a way where the interests of the Russian people and the interests of the Putin regime are diametrically opposed. Let me give you an example. Theft from the budget and corruption, which indeed, if you look at it, is what triggered the whole Ukrainian thing. It's a very simple answer. What started Ukraine? The rating of Putin started to plunge. Now why? Because the corrupt activity of those around Putin was something that society just got tired of. They were fed up with all this corruption. They were fed up with seeing people stealing from the state coffers. And in order to do something about his falling ratings, that's why they started the Ukrainian thing, this reckless invasion of Ukraine. And you need to get the people to realize the extent to which the people around Putin have wealth in the West, because their money is here in the West. Yes, now they're trying to transfer it to Asia to some extent, but not all of them have started to do that. So if the sanctions were demonstrated to be moral sanctions, sanctions against the people who are stealing from Russia and concealing that theft with military operations in Ukraine, if you can show who these people are, where their villas are, in Italy, in Germany, and I'm sure you all know exactly, well, it is known exactly where they are, these villas, why don't you do this? I don't know. I have no answer to that. Why don't you show the pictures? Well, I do have an answer, but it's not a pleasant one. And linked to this is the question of lustration, de-Putinization. Russia is a huge country. And the total lustration which was carried out, for example, in Georgia, wouldn't be possible in Russia. A total clear out of the previous regime. But without doubt, there are those at various levels in the hierarchy of power who wouldn't be able to keep their posts in a new Russia. And I agree that there was a serious mistake made when, after the fall of the Soviet Union, even at a moral level, there was no condemnation of the people who were directly involved and participated in the crimes which were perpetrated then. We cannot repeat that mistake. So how many people are we talking about? Well, in my speeches in Russia, I have said that we're talking about roughly 10% of the current political and administrative body. So this is a few tens of thousands of people. And if you compare this with the sanctions list from Europe, it's 113 people. And although they are scared about this, their fear is kind of virtual. It's a bit distant. It's not pressing. Would such activity be justified? When people in Europe would say, if you would stand up and say, we don't want to have any kind of business with people who are stealing from Russia and who are using the money to be militarily aggressive against other countries. If you were able to show people clearly where the money is going, which comes from Russia, then yes, you would be able to convince people in Russia. It would be a shock if they saw the amount of sums which were paid to lawyers of the government in The Hague, in the Yukos case. It was clear that they were going to lose that case right from the start. And if people knew that they had spent dozens of millions of dollars on that, there are hundreds of such examples you could adduce. Why are you not telling everybody about this? I don't know. I want to answer a very tough question about Crimea. On various occasions I have said, and I'm prepared to repeat here, that the annexation of Crimea is illegal, despite all the grounds which were adduced for this. None of that is important. It was done against the law. But at the same time, we understand that the population of Russia, the vast majority of them, are in favor. Now, when it comes to a democratic regime, how could we run counter to what the whole population want? All I can try and do is convince people that that's not the right way, and probably there'll have to be some kind of compromise. Probably there will be a free economic zone to start with, and then a way into Europe without borders. That would be the solution to this, but this is something which would take decades. As the Ukrainian colleagues sometimes say to me, you have to give back. Well, a dictatorial regime took this territory, but a democratic regime can't act in the same way. I'm sorry that I can't answer all the questions, but the chairman is very strict, as you know. You know him better than me, and I'm afraid I have to bow to him. Thank you.
Einer muss immer die Rolle des Bad Cop spielen.
Sometimes somebody has to play the bad cop. But we've got the Prime Minister of Lebanon standing outside the door. He has to go to the President of Parliament at 5 o'clock. So I'm afraid we have to stick to our timetable. Mr. Khodorkovsky, I'm very grateful to you for coming. I think you've given us food for thought. And I think you can also see how much sympathy many of us have for you. So thank you very much for coming. I hope we'll be able to stay in contact.
Sorry. Sorry for you.